Some time ago, David Randall Miller discussed a simulation that he created wherein creatures evolve neural networks similar to those that you find in machine learning algorithms through the process of natural selection. I wanted to see if I could replicate what he had done and perhaps improve on it a bit, and so I've adapted much of his approach to a Unity 3D application. Throughout this video, I will depict neural networks in the same fashion that David Randall Miller depicts them, as neuronal connections between nodes, with green arrows representing positively charged dendrites, and red arrows representing negatively charged dendrites. This video will encompass the first steps that I've taken toward creating this simulation, and in future videos I will implement more features to the simulation, such as the search for food and survival conditions that might change within a generation, and competition among species. Be sure to check out David Randall Miller's video, which I've linked in the description below, to see how his simulation works. The two major concepts that we need to refamiliarize ourselves with are Darwinian evolution, or the evolution of species by means of natural selection, and neural networks, as can arise in machine learning algorithms or other kinds of computer AI research. For Darwinian evolution, the most important thing to keep in mind is that the animals that you're likely to encounter in the world are those that either reproduce a lot or survive for a very long time. However, in the real world, the environment changes fairly rapidly and consistently. And so for species to persist, there needs to be some mechanism of adaptation. On Earth, that mechanism takes the form of DNA, and the accumulation of mutations in a species' genome can present an individual from that species with either greater adaptive fitness to its environment or deleterious effects that cause it to never reproduce. Together, these two outcomes form the basis of speciation by means of natural selection. That is, that the environment is selecting for mutations that give greater adaptive fitness to a species. For neural networks that you commonly see in AI applications, the intent is to mimic as closely as possible how neural networks function in actual animals. In a real brain, you might have a very dense network of neurons connecting to each other with branches that we call dendrites. Some of these neurons may have only one function, such as taking part in some sort of sensory perception, or calculating the necessary muscle movements for some kind of motor action, and some neurons do only calculations. And in a real brain, the dendrites between neurons might send reinforcing signals to the neurons that they connect to, or they might send negatively reinforcing signals to turn off some action potential in the terminating neuron. In our simulation, we want to simulate as closely as possible neural networks like these that are subject to the rules of natural selection. And so we'll need some kind of mobile creatures that are subject to survival criteria that have neural networks inside of them that control their behavior. So this is what our creature looks like in the simulation. And inside the creature, we have some neurons inside of its brain. Some of those neurons are motor neurons that have only inputs, so they are only syncs. And these motor neurons move the creature or perform some sort of action. The creature also has adder neurons, or internal neurons, that are both sources and sinks. And the action potential of an adder neuron is to sum the values of all of its inputs and return the hyperbolic tangent of that sum. That hyperbolic tangent has some value between -1 and 1, and these internal neurons or adder neurons can connect to other adder neurons or to motor neurons. And you can have any number of these that you want. And then we have sensory neurons, which are only sources. These sense some internal or external states that might be about the creature or about the world, like the creature's position, its age, its speed. These output some value between -1 and 1, and these can connect to adder neurons or to motor neurons. And so inside of each creature is a genome, and in that genome there are some number of genes that represent dendrites, or those connections between neurons. These dendrites are stored as a 32-bit number. The first 8 bits of this 32-bit number represents the source neuron, with the first bit of those 8 bits controlling whether it's from a sensor neuron or an adder neuron, and the next 7 bits are just the ID of the neuron. So in this example, these 8 bits represent sensor 7, and this ID is modded with the total number of neurons of that type there are. So in this case, if there aren't 7 sensors, you mod this number with however many sensors there are, and use that as the ID. And then the next 8 bits represent the sync neuron for that dendrite, again with the first digit controlling what kind of neuron it is, in this case 0 for motors and 1 for adders. And then the last 16 bits represent the strength of that connection, or the strength of that dendrite. This is stored as an unsigned half-precision float, and so we do some simple math and we get some value between -4 and 4. And then the world is just a 2-dimensional Cartesian plane, and these creatures might have certain behaviors that come from how their brains are wired up. And so, for example, if a creature has a gene that connects its X position sensor to its move Y motor neuron with a positively charged dendrite, then this creature would seek positive Y if its X position was positive, and it would seek negative Y if its X position was negative. And this would form half of the needed behaviors for corner seeking. If it also had a gene that connected its sense Y position neuron to the move X motor neuron with a negatively charged dendrite, then if the creature finds itself in a position with a positive Y value, it will seek negative X values, and if it finds itself in a position with negative Y values, it will seek positive X values. Together, these genes would manifest as corner-seeking behavior, where the creature would move to either the top left corner or the bottom right corner of the world, depending on its orientation to the origin. And so, returning to the world again, at any point in a generation, I can define a region that is a safe zone for the creatures, such that if a creature finds itself inside of that safe zone by the end of the generation, then it survives and passes on its genes to the next generation. Conversely, if it finds itself outside of that safe zone by the end of the generation, it does not pass its genes on to the next generation. And at the end of each generation, these creatures that did find themselves inside of the safe zone reproduce asexually to produce a number of offspring that each have subtle mutations in the genetic code of the parent. These mutations are represented as single bit flips in a random location on a random gene. And with a simple parameter on the simulation, I can control how frequently those mutations occur at each reproduction event. For this project, I used Unity 3D because it has a real-time integrator, so I can make runtime decisions about the survival criteria for these creatures. A big secondary benefit is that I can use the built-in collision boxes in Unity 3D to allow the creatures to sense each other and to push each other around. I'm also using the creature's genome to compute an RGB value that I apply to their appearance in the simulation, so that at a glance I can get a sense of the genetic variability. This is an example of high variability, and conversely this is an example of low variability, as it would appear in the simulation. And if we look at my implementation of the neuron base class, which forms the basis for my adder neurons, this takes the creature in the world as constructor arguments and returns via a virtual call method the hyperbolic tangent of the value stored on the neuron. These are some examples of some sensory neurons that override that call method to return their own sensory data. Here are the 2 motor neurons that I have implemented so far, just the MoveX and MoveY motor neurons. And then all of these neurons are stored on the creature in dictionaries. And this way, as the program parses through the genetic code of each creature, it can grab these neurons from these dictionaries and increment their internal values or perform their call methods. And so in the simulations update method, for each dendrite, we perform the call method of the source neuron, multiply it by the strength of the dendrite, and add that to the value of the sync neuron. At each step, we also perform the call method of any motor neurons that are referenced in the creature's neural net. When the simulation begins, you'll notice the creatures are moving about randomly, so I'll create a safe zone at the top of the world here, and only the creatures who are in this safe zone at the end of each generation get to pass on their genes to the next generation. And you can already see after just a couple of generations that most of the creatures now have a preferred behavior to move to the top of the world. This isn't exactly evolution at this point, this is just selection, because there haven't been enough generations for mutations to accumulate. But it's also worth saying at this point that none of this is scripted behavior. All of these creatures wired their own brains. And so let's take a look at the brain of one of these creatures. The only motor neuron that's active in this creature's brain is the move-Y neuron, which is unsurprising. And the dominant dendrite here is the one that connects the sense-age neuron to the move-Y neuron, because the other connections from the position X sensor neuron that passes through the adder neurons essentially cancel each other out. And so in this case, as the creature gets older, it preferentially wants to move to greater Y positions, which is exactly what it needs to do to pass on its genes. Now let's establish a new survival condition for this population, such that only creatures that are in the center of the world get to pass on their genes. And the effect of this is to select for mutants from the generation of creatures that seek the top of the world, and the immediate effect of doing that is to drastically reduce the available genetic variability in the gene pool. In nature, genetic bottlenecks like this produce a condition called the founder's effect, where genes or mutations that previously had a very low frequency in the population can suddenly come to dominate the gene pool. Now let's look inside the brain of one of the creatures in this population. This brain pattern is a little bit more complicated than ones we've seen before, and so maybe pause the video and see if you can work out for yourself how this neural net is producing the behavior that we saw in the population. Like before, the only motor neuron that is active here is the move-Y neuron, and it is taking as inputs from the adder neurons the opposite of the Y position sensory neuron. This has the effect of moving the creature downward if it's above the x-axis, and upward if it's below the x-axis. But you'll notice as I start the simulation again, that this isn't exactly the optimal behavior for this survival condition. However, it is sufficient for the genes of these creatures to be passed on to the next generation. This also happens quite frequently in nature, where evolution doesn't drive creatures to the optimal solution. It only drives creatures to a solution that is good enough for the survival criteria that those creatures face. Let's let this simulation run a bit longer and see if evolution can come up with a better solution to this environment. And as you can see, it doesn't take very long before the creatures have a much better adapted behavior to this survival condition, as evidenced by just the sheer number of creatures that are piling into the center of the world here. And so let's have a look at how they're doing this. This creature in particular has evolved center-seeking behavior by connecting the Y position sensor with a negatively charged dendrite to the move-Y motor neuron, and connecting the X position sensor with a negatively charged dendrite to the move-X motor neuron. This creature no doubt descended from some kind of ancestor that had a mutation in its genetic code that added the move-X motor neuron to its available neural net. And from there, evolutionary pressure drove toward this kind of neural net that would cause a creature to seek the center of the world. But this is kind of a messy way to do this. And in nature, oftentimes, an adaptation to a new environmental challenge can evolve in a messy way like this, because of all of the inherited genetic baggage of prior generations, and their adaptations to their environments. And so let's start this simulation over from generation 0, and apply the condition that only creatures who find themselves in the center of the world get to reproduce, and see how a clean, highly variable gene pool adapts to this condition. Now, this creature has the same center-seeking behavior, but in a much more streamlined fashion. In fact, the N0 adder neuron isn't actually doing anything because it's not taking any inputs from anywhere. And so the Y position sensory neuron is just directly controlling the Y movement. And similarly, because the N1 adder neuron isn't taking inputs from anything else, the X position sensory neuron is just directly controlling the move X position for center-seeking behavior. And now at this point, I can just force huge population shifts by changing the survival condition, and so I'll do that a couple of times. It's interesting that watching these simulated creatures flit about in this world is a bit like watching cells in a petri dish. So what are some of the lessons that we've learned from this? Well, first, and somewhat surprisingly, it doesn't take very many generations for a population to adapt to new survival conditions. This is due in large part to the mutation rate that I set for my simulation. In all of the examples I showed here, I used a mutation rate of 5%, meaning that on average 5% of all of the bits in a parent's genome were bit flipped during a reproduction event. The simulations also demonstrated that the mutations that will adapt a creature to a new environment need not be the same ones in every instance, such as when two populations convergently evolved for center-seeking behavior in somewhat different ways. And concurrently, this also demonstrated that evolution can only work within the constraints of the genome that a species already possesses, and so adaptations to a novel environment don't necessarily result in the most optimized solution to that environmental problem. As I mentioned near the beginning, this video covers only the first steps I've taken in implementing neural networks that are subject to Darwinian evolution. In the future, I would like to implement more survival criteria besides just a safe zone, and those might include the search for food, or safe zones that move around within a generation, and I'd like to implement some kind of predation and predator avoidance behaviors. So stay tuned as this project grows.